Hi, everyone. I'm going to give you just a moment to start gathering. Really looking forward to today's conversation. This program will be focused on journalists in peril, creating a safer, equitable future together. I'm Julie Moose. I'm the Executive Director of the National Press Club Journalism Institute. I'm really thankful to be here with you all today. Really happy to have our wonderful group of journalists here with us and panelists here with us. So thank you for making the time to be with us here today, and thank you all for being here. We're looking forward to a great conversation among the panel, and we hope that you will join into the conversation by asking questions in the Q&A queue as they come up, and we'll start bringing them in the second half of the program. And we're going to start with an introduction. I'm really happy to introduce my friend Jill Geisler, who is leadership columnist for our daily newsletter, The Latest, and is also the Bill Plant Chair in Leadership and Media Integrity at Loyola University, and the Freedom Forum Fellow in Women's Leadership, where she teaches about workplace integrity and allyship. So, Jill, thank you so much for being here as the moderator, and I will turn the program over to you.
All right, let's go. You know, journalists aren't supposed to be use hyperbole easily, right? We've got to say everything precisely, and yet we are using the term journalists in peril. And peril is a very strong word, but Sarah Matthews, you are a staff attorney for the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, and it's not really an overstatement, is it?
No, not at all. Thanks, Jill. Yeah, we've actually seen a huge increase in the risk that a journalist will be attacked or arrested while covering a protest. So just since May, we've seen an unprecedented number of journalists attacked and arrested during the Black Lives Matter protests. So during this time, journalists have reported 812 total press freedom incidents to the US Press Freedom Tracker. That's a nonprofit that I'm on the board of, which documents all press freedom violations in the US. So this includes arrests, attacks, equipment searches and seizures, et cetera. So to give you, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, to give you a sense of how large that number is, the tracker recorded just 152 incidents for all of 2019. So we've seen more than a 5-fold increase just in the last 3.5 months. And just quickly, 85% of those incidents were at the hands of law enforcement. It includes 108 arrests. For comparison, we saw just 9 arrests in all of 2019. And it also includes 203 physical attacks, about 70% by law enforcement, and 187 incidents where journalists were hit with rubber bullets or other projectiles. For comparison, we saw just 34 attacks in all of 2019. So these are staggering numbers.
And even right now, there's a reporter, Josie Wong, from KPCC in Los Angeles, who was arrested, thrown to the ground. Her quote, she said, it was like being tossed around the ocean and then slammed into a rock. She was alleged to have obstructed officers. The videos from many organizations don't have evidence of that. What are you doing about it?
Yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned it. That's just a great example of the types of attacks that we've seen in recent months. She was injured so badly she had to go to the hospital, and she's still facing obstruction charges, which is absurd. And so the Reporters Committee will be sending a letter today on behalf of a coalition of news organizations to the LA Sheriff's Department about this incident. We're urging them to drop the charges immediately against Josie, and to also provide a public explanation for the arrest and the subsequent false statements that were made about it, and also to take additional steps to protect reporters.
Well, let's continue on the front lines. Alex Marquardt, you were in the center of things in the DC protests, and that's not the first time you have faced imminent danger. How would you rank the kind of threats that you experience as a frontline journalist in the midst of protest?
I mean, it was really surprising to see the level of violence that was directed against journalists during the protests. And I wasn't out in the country. I was in Washington, D.C., right in front of the White House. The police forces that I was dealing with were federal forces, U.S. Park Police, National Guard, Secret Service Police. I was down at CNN yesterday doing a hit on something else. And the cameraman was the cameraman who I'd been with during the protests. And he reminded me that on the first night that we were out there, you know, we made it very clear that we were journalists. We had our badges around our necks or on our belts, ready to show the police officers. And as they advanced to clear out the area in front of the White House at Lafayette Park, my journalist Josh Rapalgo got shoved up against the fence, and he pulled out his badge to show them again that he was a CNN cameraman. The police officer from the U.S. Park Police looked at it and whacked him in the knee with his baton, and he was injured and hurting for quite some time. Fast forward a couple days later, it was late at night. We were far away from the crowds, and it was very clear that we were journalists. And the U.S. Park Police came down the line spraying us with pepper spray, and we were shouting that we shouted press, press, press. It was obvious. Beyond the badges, we had a camera, we had lights. We were far away from the protesters. They sprayed us with this pepper spray. Then they lobbed a flashbang over the fence at us. It landed at our feet. And it was just so clearly directed at us. And anybody who hasn't been near a flashbang, they are damn loud and kick off a fair amount of smoke. So it was really surprising to see that kind of thing directed at journalists in the nation's capital. You're absolutely right. This, you know, I've been around plenty of conflict before I came back to DC 2 years ago. Abby was mentioning something before we got on this call. We always have security with us. And it is kind of stunning. It is stunning that here in America, we need to have security with our news crews to keep us safe. I was not expecting this kind of violence directed towards journalists when I moved back to the States a couple of years ago.
Michael Santiago, as a visual journalist, you're with Getty Images now. I have also heard from journalists of color that they can be targeted, especially so, just because the people who want to attack them are going to characterize them in some different way. What's been your experience?
Yeah, I mean, for me, when I covered the protests in Rochester, I can't say that they targeted me because I looked like the protesters. The police there were targeting absolutely everybody. And it did not matter whether you had a press badge or not. Just like Alex was saying, I saw TV crews getting targeted specifically by police with tear gas and flashbangs, and that's something that completely surprised me because, you know, they can say that I look like everybody else because my cameras sometimes are down, but you know, guys holding the big TV cameras and lights, they're absolutely pressed. And I had this one incident the second day where, you know, a black police officer came up to me afterwards. He was like, dude, I know you were pressed, and I was trying to warn you that they were getting ready to target you, and you couldn't hear me. So like they knew who was pressed or not, and they were targeting us. I mean, luckily I had on a vest, so a lot of the pepper balls that were shot at me bounced off. But you know, once they started to see that they started targeting my legs, they went towards my head, and you know, they really weren't caring at all. And there was one Twitter account that I started to follow when I got up there, and they clearly showed a video of police officers throwing tear gas canisters at a herd of press. So there's video evidence out there of police targeting us.
Yeah. Abby, you're on the front lines as well, both whether it's a White House news conference or as recently as a Trump rally in Tulsa. What's been your experience with antagonism and, frankly, danger?
Yeah, I think tying all of these things together, there's been a real cultural shift in how journalists are treated in this country, and also specifically at political events, which I've been covering for a decade now. in the Obama administration, in the Trump administration, in the 2012, 2016, and now 2020 campaigns. And I've never experienced this kind of level of potential risk to journalists, both physical harm, abuse online and offline, and also now with the coronavirus, you have reporters who are putting themselves potentially in danger to cover presidential events, both at the White House and out on the road. So there is something different happening here. You know, as Alex mentioned, when we go out to cover Trump events, we have security with us, multiple security guards in many cases, to protect us from people going to rallies to attend political rallies. That is not something that I had ever experienced prior to this era in politics. I've had people come up trying to sort of almost physically intimidate me on camera, screaming, CNN sucks. I mean, we've all seen the rallies where the president turns the crowd around to face the pen of cameras and falsely claims that we've turned the cameras off and that we're fake news. So it's a cultural thing that comes from the top. And I do think that, that's one element of this whole thing, is just dealing with the president really encouraging his supporters to treat reporters as the enemy. And also, when it comes to covering protests, there's never heard from the federal government or from the White House this idea that reporters should not be attacked in the course of doing their jobs by police or by anyone else. That is never said. And I think that the result of that is that you are seeing more of these attacks, on reporters, physical attacks on reporters, or like my colleague, Omar Jimenez, who was literally arrested on camera in the course of doing his job. To me, these things are all connected. And as someone who's been covering politics, I've never been, it has never been a situation where in politics I felt like going to a political rally was something where you had to worry about your physical safety until now.
You mentioned Omar, and the fact that that happened on camera, the fact that there was documentation, is as important as all of the other things that now are more real to people because they're seeing them. Let's talk about how, even strategically, we look out for each other, journalists look out for each other in the field to document when something is happening. What are you doing to look out for each other?
I mean, for me, one of the things that we were doing out there is that, if for the journalists, the photographers who were out there, we kind of hurdled in one spot to try to differentiate ourselves from people who were protesting. And when that wasn't working, we would make sure that everybody was, your helmet on right, fix your helmet, fix your gas mask. We were doing that kind of things and just giving each other a heads up when you can hear each other. When police, police were coming from the right, we would grab somebody and just pull them. And that's one thing like we were doing out there. We were just making sure that we would try to get everybody out of the way and just make sure everybody's gear was correct.
Sarah, you do training. What are you training journalists to do to protect themselves?
Oh, we could do a whole hour just on that, but I will tell you, we do recommend that people use the buddy system. And so team up with another reporter, someone who can help you, can look out for you. That way, if you are being arrested or you think you're going to be arrested, you can give your equipment to that other person. They can keep it safe because that will be taken from you. And that's one of the big issues we've seen is equipment seizures by law enforcement. And sometimes it can take a long time to get that back, which is very problematic. But there are a number of things. In addition, we always advise journalists to do their homework in advance. So to research the riot control tactics in the area where they'll be reporting and bring personal protective equipment as appropriate. So like Michael was saying, he was wearing a vest that protected him from the less lethal bullets that were shot at him, at his chest at least. So that's one thing. We also advise folks to wear their press credentials prominently. People are concerned sometimes they feel like it makes them a target, but there are also, it's not like protesters are not being targeted, so I think it doesn't, not wearing press credentials doesn't protect you from that. But in addition, there are some legal reasons why it can be beneficial to identify yourself. And also, we always advise journalists to have the number of a local criminal attorney written on their arms. And if they don't have that, they can call our hotline. We have a 24/7 legal hotline for journalists. And so they can call our 800 number, which I can drop in the chat. It's 800-336-4243. So those are the types of things that we advise. We do have a tip sheet, which I can also drop in the chat that summarizes all these things.
But sometimes, Alex, it isn't just being out there in public, it's being online where you've also been the subject of attacks.
Yeah, if I could just bounce off what Sarah was saying though quickly, the silver lining in this is that, when you come under attack, journalists come under attack, there is a banding together. And I think that's extra important when freelancers are out there oftentimes by themselves. Any sense of competition completely goes out the window when there is an attack on the press at large. And so we're constantly sharing information, sharing details, sharing equipment if we can, allowing others to jump in our pod, if you will, to if we're near the front line, and that is absolutely crucial. There really is a sense of camaraderie, when you are facing that kind of onslaught. And to, Abby is someone who's been out there at rally after rally, and I will say that my colleagues who do that, and I'm not a White House correspondent, I'm not a political correspondent, they are dealing with so much, such viciousness often on a daily or weekly basis that I don't think most people really appreciate. I've dipped into a couple of those rallies, so as a relative novice, it really does come across as something that is particularly pointed. I think we've all seen the president attack the press at these rallies on TV, but until you're in that room, I don't think you really appreciate, an entire room, thousands of people turning around and looking at you really aggressively because they're being goaded on by the president, because they're being incited by the president. The first rally that I went to of Trump's in August 2017 in Phoenix, it was just this diatribe that he went on against the press that at one point, one of my colleagues from another network texted me from 6 feet away because it was so loud saying, "Is this the night that one of us gets killed?" It is incredibly scary. And to Abby's point, there's rarely, if ever, any sort of condemnation from the White House, from members of Congress, from the Secret Service. You just don't hear that. So it is very, very scary. And then you're right, it does go online. And there have been times when, the troll army, for lack of a better description, has come after me, and on a number of occasions, it was because they were being activated, if you will, by members of the Trump administration. I cover the intelligence community. The former acting director of national intelligence, Rick Grinnell, was someone who who came after me a number of times on Twitter, and then his followers, his fans, his supporters, and those of the president would then turn on me online and with real viciousness. And I've been one of the lucky ones where it's online. It's in my mentions on Twitter. It hasn't crossed over into any sort of threats on my home or my family. But that's certainly something that happens a lot. And there have been a number of people at CNN who have really had to take measures to safeguard themselves and their families.
Abby, you are strong and you are successful, but you have also the distinction of having been singled out by the president for personal abuse. At one news conference, he said to you, "I watch you a lot, you ask a lot of stupid questions." Who supports you in times like that? And what would you like when that kind of thing happens?
Yeah, well, I think that was actually a good example of how other journalists do support each other. I think a lot of reporters and friends of mine who I've worked with really kind of stepped up to defend me, which was nice, but in some ways I don't know that it was entirely necessary, because I think that sometimes, my view of some of these attacks, particularly when they come from the president, is that you have to be careful not to further amplify them, because the objective is to shift the attention away from whatever you were asking about and onto the back and forth between you and him. Right after that happened, I was at the White House, obviously, and I did get a call from Jeff Zucker, who's the head of CNN, and he wanted to sort of make sure that I was fine, that, I felt supported. And I thought, and that is, not unusual that, he would sort of just reach out to make sure that you were fine. But, again, this is something that the president does often in an effort to distract and also to direct vitriol toward a certain person. And so my strategy in dealing with that was just to try not to engage as much as possible, especially with the sort of trolls that became activated online. There have been other times in my career where I've experienced a kind of sort of almost troll army coming after me. And, in one case, actually, this was when I worked at the Washington Post, I had reported something, I'd done some reporting on social media and in a story, and it had angered, sort of Trump allied supporters who then started to try to dox me and also dox my family. So there was one point, usually these things I don't get too concerned about them because a lot of things that happen online don't often translate into other things. But in this case, some of these Twitter accounts found a picture that I had posted on Father's Day of me and my dad outside of my parents' home. And they, basically tried to identify my parents' dress and post it online, as retribution for what I had reported. And that was one of the few times where I felt like, it crosses the line when it goes from me. I'm a reporter. I'm used to people to being in scrutiny. I appear on television, but to my parents, and I actually had to, encourage my parents to change their passwords, to lock down their accounts, to be extra vigilant about people around their home, and to call the police if they saw anybody around their home. And at the Post, they offered that if I needed any sort of security for myself or my family, that they would provide that. And so that's the new normal that we're kind of in right now, where there is physical security, but online, sometimes the stuff that is happening online that is being egged on by prominent accounts and egged on by prominent actors can actually translate into potential harm to people. Luckily, nothing happened to my family, but it's one of the few times that I've been concerned about that sort of thing.
And you have the benefit of working in an organization that has an infrastructure that has security. A lot of freelancers don't have that. A lot of people who are working in small TV stations or newspapers may not have that. And so just reckoning with that is so important.
And
Mike,
can I just mention real quick, just before because I almost forgot to say this. I just think that because for the people watching, it is so important to pay attention to your virtual security, to have multi-factor authentication on all of your accounts, and also to urge especially if you're in the public eye, to urge your family members to do the same, because it's not just you that people will go after. They'll go after your family members, and they can try to do things that can actually cause real problems if you don't pay attention to your passwords and things like that we don't really think about as journalists, but it's really important to do that. And I learned that really the hard way several years ago.
Thank you. Michael, I wanted to shift to you to a different kind of allyship. You are literally in a new job. You stepped away from a job on principle because you had supported a colleague. I'll let you tell that story because I think it's important, but you stepped up to support a colleague who you thought was treated unfairly. Yes.
In the context of everything that was going on, this whole the Black Lives Matter movement, one of the things that I've always said is that Black women aren't shown as much support as Black men are. And my ex-colleague at the time, Alex Johnson, she had tweeted out images, actually my images from the Kenny Chesney concert of what happened afterwards and the destruction that happens. And, made an innocuous comparison between protests and that. And she ended up getting barred from protests. And as soon as I found out what had happened, I immediately stepped up and I had her back. And then other colleagues of mine, had her back also as well. And we were all pretty much barred from covering Black Lives Matter protests. And I never thought twice about coming to bat for her and defending her at all. I mean, she's a talented young journalist, and she didn't deserve to be taken off of coverage. She's from Pittsburgh. Her family members are in law enforcement, and her friends were out there protesting, so she should have been out there covering these protests. And I never thought twice about having her back. I didn't think twice about losing my job. And when all that was going on, there was a lot of I saw a Twitter moment about people who left journalism because of things that they experienced at their jobs. And I think about, what would have happened if myself and other colleagues didn't come to Alex Johnson's back. She possibly could leave journalism and we might have lost a very talented journalist. And that's happened over and over again. And I don't take back what I did. I would do it all over again if I had to. Luckily I landed on my feet, but I think we should come to the defense of our colleagues, especially if we know for a fact that they're being treated unfairly. If we have solidarity with each other when we're out on the field, we should have solidarity with each other inside the newsrooms as well.
Right. And this was at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette.
Correct.
And literally was criticized by other journalism organizations because of the narrowness of the decision that was made to bar anyone who supported her from covering Black Lives Matter protests when they were supporting essentially a tweet that compared the mess after the Kenny Chesney concerts to destruction that had been done or damage that had been done by demonstrators, right?
Yeah, and I'll add that happened in May, I think beginning of June, and we're second week of September, and she's still barred from covering protests.
Wow. All right, complete change of subject, because I'm not going to let this time go by without getting to Abby to talk about something entirely different, which is you just announced that you have got a book coming out in 2022. Tell us about it.
Yeah, I do. So I am writing a book about the 1984 and 1988 presidential races that were run by Reverend Josie Jackson Sr. And the point of the book is to try to take a look at the elements of that campaign that were the precursors for the current political moment. I think this was really the moment that we're living in with all these protests, the George Floyd protests, the conversation about race and about economic equity, they all kind of had a lot of their beginnings in that race. And I think many people don't realize that before Barack Obama, Jesse Jackson had come the closest of any Black man or any Black political figure to the presidency. He came in second place in the 1988 race. And so much of what the Democratic Party is in terms of Black political power comes from that era. So the book is going to be really an exploration of what happened at that time and how the Democratic Party was shaped by it, and also how we can reevaluate and learn from the messages that he tried to espouse then, back when, I think back in the 1980s, many Americans were not as sort of open to messages of racial equity as they are today. And so I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned about how he communicated, not just to Black Americans, but also to many white Americans about race, and how we can learn from that as we're in this moment where a lot of people are starting to open their eyes to this conversation. So,
well, if you take a book leave, could you wait until after the election? Because I don't want to stop.
It will definitely not be before the election. It's going to be a busy couple of months covering this election. So I'll be here for all of that.
Okay. I'd like each of your advice to other journalists right now about both their physical and their emotional safety and well-being. And I want to start with Alex, please.
In what context, for example?
What advice do you have? Somebody's going out, either they're a new journalist, they're going out to cover their first rally, or they've had their first experience of getting trolled. What do you do? What should you know?
Well, You should know that it is a pretty hostile landscape out there, both online and in the streets. I think we've touched on two main physical areas today, whether it's in the realm of politics and those rallies, and then during the protests. You know, it's very easy to say, but obviously have your wits about you, and have a strong team around you. That was the best part of the people that I was teamed up with during the Black Lives Matter protests here in DC, is that, I had 2 cameramen, a producer, and 2 security guards. So that was 6 of us. And, I come from a network that has plenty of resources. So I was really blessed to have a team that size. So you really could have eyes in every different direction. And the moment anyone sensed that something was off, we could, respond to that. That's not always going to be the case for, say, a print reporter who's working by him or herself, a freelance photographer who's working by him or herself. So I've always been a fan of nimble teams, but teams nonetheless, and not working alone. And so I had a lot of freelance reporter friends in the Middle East covering war zones, and they would always band together, 4 people to a car kind of thing. And again, I think there's this notion that we're all competitors, and while that's true, that doesn't mean that we're isolated. And so I would definitely emphasize the camaraderie. I've seen photographers banding together and going out in dangerous places, and you would think, oh well, don't they want the exclusive? Don't they want the best images? Yes, but there are so many options once you're out there to shoot or to interview, to report, that competition is almost second to the safety in numbers and the benefits of working with a team. So I think it's going to be teamwork, and it's going to be really having a good sense of the lay of the land, and asking as many questions of other journalists or protesters or officials as possible. I'm sure Sarah has a list of things that people should do before they go out into a crowd, but I would definitely say, gathering as much information as possible about the situation that you're going to face, and then going out there with people who are experienced and who you trust.
So apart from security, I'm going to ask Michael and Abby, what are things that you always pack when you're going out into what you think may be a potentially hostile situation? What do you carry with you?
Helmet, gas mask, several gas masks. And I'm lucky that at Getty, they've provided me equipment to and things to help out in case I get out there and there's gas masks and gas and tears throwing pepper gas going out. So they provided wipes for my face and my cameras and stuff like that. So that's things that I have always with me. And I write down the phone numbers of lawyers and stuff like that I need on my arms. So having pencils and pens are always good.
Abby, what do you always carry?
Well, it's a little bit different because at CNN, we're a little bit of a different target. So I actually always have my badge, but we have a CNN lanyard. I actually typically don't wear my CNN lanyard if I'm out. I will wear something that is a little less conspicuous because it's red and it says CNN in big letters on it. But that allows me to have my badge on me at all times so that law enforcement can clearly see it's a press pass, but that, regular people who are sort of looking to cause trouble don't necessarily immediately identify that with my specific outlet. I think that when we were going to Tulsa, we did sort of have at the ready our helmets and masks and vests. Luckily, we didn't actually need to use them in Tulsa, but we did bring those with us. And I think that at political rallies, we tend to be a little bit less, it's not as physically, in most cases, physically dangerous. But I will say that if there are any people who do cover political rallies, we are talking about a lot of risks on this call, but I don't want anybody to come away from this thinking that you can't engage with voters or engage with attendees in a safe manner, you really do need to use good judgment, try to be around other people whenever possible, and also, try to evaluate the person that you're engaging with. One of the different things about Trump rallies in particular is that they're preceded a lot of times by lengthy tailgates that sometimes last days. And so people are out there kind of partying. And so you need to be really mindful of who you're approaching and make sure that you're not approaching someone who might be, compromised in any way or looking for trouble or, anything like that. Just look. I always observe people for a while before I decide to approach them, and then I'll approach them. And sometimes even if I'm working with a producer, we might like double tag team it. My producer might go talk to someone first, and then I come along. So that way we kind of have like a sort of a low impact kind of first touch, and then come in with a camera so that people don't decide that they're going to be crazy because there's a camera in their face. There are a lot of things that you can do to sort of minimize the risk without jeopardizing your ability to report and to actually engage with people while you're out there.
Sarah, I want to read. Oh, go ahead, Alex.
I just want to emphasize what Abby said. It's often not about what you're taking to a certain situation. It's often what you're not taking. And one of the first most remarkable things that I learned when I got to CNN in the US 3 years ago was so often we have to be careful not to identify ourselves. So to Abby's point, like a lanyard that says CNN, but that extends to mic flags on a microphone or to a satellite van that might normally say CNN on it, or a camera that might have a CNN decal. That stuff's not there anymore because it simply has made us targets. And so I think we really have to emphasize that this is the moment that we're living in that we need to try to fix, where something as simple as a network's logo can make you a target. If you're in a war zone and you're wearing a flak jacket, oftentimes you'll have something that says press right across the front because you don't want to be confused with, say, the soldiers that you're with, the rebels that you're with. Ideally, hopefully, you are an independent observer. And so there's always this discussion of, do you wear the same colors or different colors from the military that you're covering? That was a discussion in Afghanistan. If you're embedding with US forces, don't wear something that's camouflage because you are an independent observer. And sometimes they would make the argument, no, you have to wear the same color as us because we don't want to stand out to the Taliban, for example. And now we're having to have the same discussions here in the US, and we're having to essentially minimize our footprint, our what we're advertising to a large crowd, because that makes us targets. I don't have a solution for that. It's just it's a fact, and that's really troubling, and it's something that hopefully we can address, and hopefully we can figure out how to change.
Thank you, Alex. There's a question that's come in, and I want to address it to Sarah. Lynn Adrian, who is a former network producer, now teaches graduate students at Syracuse. She writes, one of my former students, an African-American woman, spent 2 weeks in Minneapolis covering the aftermath of the George Floyd murder for one of the networks. She declined an assignment to cover an evening police rally because she did not feel safe. She was not punished for the decision. Journalists have to speak up for their own safety. This idea now, Sarah, of knowing when, especially as a news organization, you say to people, it's okay to step away. We're not going to put you in danger. What kind of advice do you have for news leaders about supporting their teams?
It's a hard one. We always say safety comes first. And so, ultimately it's a judgment call, but you have to do what you think is right under the circumstances. And I completely respect that journalist in Minneapolis, when she felt like it wasn't safe for her to cover the protest. I think it's really important for newsrooms to respect that decision. By way of example, when we give protest trainings, we always advise that people put safety first. If you can keep a bit of a distance, at the protest from where police are interacting with protesters, for example, and you can still get the shot you need, try to do that, but you have to always be conscious of the risk that you're taking on. And the closer you get, the more likely it is that you may come under fire, that you may be attacked or arrested. And so if you can keep a safe distance, as much as possible, that's always the best thing. But it's a difficult you know, it's a constant challenge, I think, and it's ultimately a judgment call for the journalist and to make with, you know, his or her editor.
I do a lot of work with local TV news groups, and fortunately, they have also, because they're really the hometown team that's on the ground in many of the cities in which demonstrations are taking place, they've really gone to great lengths, both to protect from coronavirus, as well as obviously the other safety issues that they face. But here's a question. We've always said we're not the story, the story's the story, right? And yet, Deborah Stein, who's watching right now, says, I don't think the media is covering enough these direct physical attacks on the media outside of the crowds. I've seen a few cases, but not many. What more do you think the media itself should do to make the case clear? Are there lawsuits going on, et cetera? That's a toss-up. Are we covering it enough? Is the message out there?
I mean, I don't think so much. I mean, I could talk about for something that I experienced in Rochester. I think one of the nights there, a lot of the articles that came out the following day, the headlines were 8 police officers were injured, but it never talked about how many people who were out there in the crowds who were injured. You know, there was like over 100 protesters who were out there who were injured, and plus several journalists as well. So I think that, and that goes back to the whole question that's happening now in you know, in journalism, is that should we take police officers at their words, and this whole objectivity and having both sides, but are we having both sides also, you know, when it comes to these protests? So, you know, I think that we should start covering, you know, if police officers are hurt, find out also who also was hurt on the other side as well.
Right. I think, Michael, that speaks to another one of the posts that have come in. This is anonymous, but says, how has seeing police violence toward journalists and subsequent misleading statements that police have often issued impacted your reporting on police moving forward? Has what we have seen, both in not just the attacks on journalists, but obviously we could go through name after name after name as we say their names, and now knowing video has shown what has been reported is different by police, is different from what we can see with our eyes. How has that changed journalists' relationship with authority?
Well, I mean, I think that this is something that is obviously long overdue, that, you know, police information is just like any other information. It can sometimes be false. It needs to be questioned and held up with the same kind of sort of scrutiny that we would hold anything else up. I mean, it's not just this year. Years ago, when I was at the Washington Post, my colleague Wesley Lowry was covering the Ferguson protests, and he was arrested in a McDonald's. And there were all kinds of misleading statements made about why he was arrested at that point. And I think it really brought to light, even back then in the Ferguson protests, the ways in which police were not differentiating between protesters and journalists, and the ways in which police were using levels of force that were obviously unnecessary under the circumstances. Now there's a lot more video, but it is imperative that we treat police like any other source, often, especially because, you know, especially local news, they are sometimes reliant on police for information as they cover, you know, public safety and crime in their communities. And it's an important role the police play, but it's also important to just interrogate that information in the same way that we would at any other time. Often, and I think that is probably more often than not, initial statements made by police are not accurate. They cannot be treated as fact. They must be treated as just allegations being made by one of the parties involved in a situation or based on preliminary information. It's really critical that we do that. And it's not just about how they treat journalists, because how they treat journalists is actually a symptom of how they treat other people who also have their own First Amendment rights and also have their rights to not be treated with excessive force in the course of law enforcement doing their jobs.
Thank you, Abby. Before I turn it over to Julie, you know, language does matter. For generations, people have said, protesters claim and authorities say. And the difference between those two words, claim and say, is putting the weight on one side. Julie, back to you.
Thank you so much, Jill. Thank you all so much for your insights. I feel like I could listen to you for much longer, but I know everybody has other responsibilities to return to. So, and thank you all who have joined us today for being with us. the Journalism Institute is here to help. We have waived all fees since March due to the pandemic. Savings of about $52,000 to participants like you. So we hope if you learned something today or from our newsletter or from us during this period that you will give our work a thumbs up by considering a donation of whatever size works for you. And we also hope you'll tell us how this program was for you so that we can continue to design the programs that will be most valuable for journalists like you and others. So we will be sending you links to do both of those things in just a few minutes, and to watch the video of this program if you'd like to catch one of the clips you might have missed or share it with somebody who wasn't able to be here today. So watch for those emails, and thank you again so much all for being here. Please stay well, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for
Thanks for having us.